This is the Jonkel Podcast, number 16. We're going to try something a little different today. We're going to try the video-in-video podcast, video response, something I've never been able to master, so we're going to give it a try starting now.
This is exactly what we should be striving for. A highly militant, exclusionary, technocratic meritocracy built around the ideas of radical traditionalism.
So exclusionary. What does that mean? Exclusionary of who? Exclusionary of what? Traditionalism. Whose traditionalism? What traditionalism? If you want to tell me that, for instance, you want to say that X is traditionalist according to what? I mean, I would argue that gay marriage is a tradition. It's not a very long tradition, but it's a tradition. We've had gay marriage for several years now. Some different countries around the world have been establishing some form of gay partnership since the 1960s. If we want to talk about transgenderism, we've been having sex reassignment surgery since the 1930s. 1930s is when sex reassignment surgery was started to be operated upon. And then if we want to go further back than that, castration, the Roman Catholic Church used to do castration, okay, and that was considered traditional, that was considered okay. So you're talking about exclusivism and radical traditionalism. How do you decide what is traditional, what is not traditional? See, from my perspective, it's better to have a framework where we kind of are a little more evolutionary in our model, and we sort of look at current conditions and we say, well, hey, let's try to figure out in some way, and that could be a command economy model, it could be a Soviet model, or it could be a more free market capitalist model, or somewhere in between, some sort of combination of that, some socialist model. But either way, I would like to look at the current situation and say, hey, what's the best way to deal with the current situation? To me, appealing tradition is a very arbitrary thing because you're looking at a past environment and you're saying, well, it worked in the past, so it must work today. But in light of rapidly changing environments due to rapidly changing technology, I don't think we can just defer to the authority of tradition and say, well, it's traditional, therefore it must be true. Now, the corollary must also be taken into account. We can't just say just because something is old, it's false. But we also can't say just because it's old, it's true. And when I'm talking about truth or falsehood, obviously we're not talking about claims of, astronomy here, whether the Earth is flat or round, whether the sun or the Earth is the center of the solar system. We're talking mostly about behavioral claims or moral claims. What should we do? And saying that traditionalism is going to help us, perhaps it could be an influence, and we could look toward tradition and say, well, okay, just for a frame of reference, here's what people used to do, and here's what we do today. But in light of rapidly changing technology, I don't think traditionalism is going to necessarily give us all the information that we need. Because our ancestors didn't have all the information that we have today. Today we have new information, not because our ancestors were dumb and they didn't know what they were talking about and they didn't know what they were looking for, but because we have new tools that actually change our environment. So for instance, again, the idea that you should castrate young boys so that you have a tenor in your church choir is a traditionalist idea. It's a traditional Catholic idea. Maybe you're one of those funky atheists out there, these traditionalist atheists, or maybe you're a pagan. But then, okay, so you're saying wipe out the last 2,000 years of Christianity. That's not traditionalism, okay? Really, traditionalism means you wipe out the last 2,000 years and you go back to paganism. Okay, well, if we're going to cherry pick our traditions like this, why don't we just wipe out the last 10,000 years of agriculturalism and go back to the traditionalism of hunting and gathering? See, that would make the most sense because our instincts are telling us that we should be hunters and we should be gatherers. That's built into our instincts. So much of human behavior can be understood in terms of gender, masculinity, femininity, the male role, the female role, human psychology, fight and flight response, different psychological types, our tendency to prefer habitual modes of work, our tendency to prefer passive socialization, not active socialization where you're constantly meeting new people. That causes anxiety. But passive socialization where you just sort of have people within a stone throw at all times, that sort of socialization. So all of these psychological concepts and behaviors can be understood very well in light of evolutionary psychology and our Paleolithic ancestral environment, the hunting and gathering environment. But does that mean we should go back to that? So again, traditionalism, just saying traditionalism, well, you need to then define that and defend. Why is your particular traditionalism better than other people's? Because some people are Christian traditionalists. They'll say that the past 2,000 years was great. Anything before that was evil paganism. But anything within the last 2,000 years is fair game for a good traditionalism. Other people will be pagans about it, and they'll say, no, I reject your Christianity. Everything before 2,000 years ago is good. Everything after that is bad. And then you get people who are in between. They'll say, well, it's not a black and white issue. But again, we have to define, how do you derive your telos? How do you derive your goal here? How do you derive which traditionalisms are good and which traditionalisms are bad? Because even if we're just talking about Western civilization, which I personally don't buy into, I don't consider myself a Western chauvinist. I don't like Western civilization or Western culture. But getting away from that semantic issue for a second, if we look at this concept of traditionalism, usually what happens is there's some discernment where someone says, oh, you know what? The good time was when we were all faithful Christians. That was the beautiful time because no one was getting divorced. Everyone was a virgin. Whatever narrative they want to spin. Other people are going to say, you know, the good time was pagan times because I read Nietzsche, and Nietzsche told me about the will to power and master morality, and that was the good traditional times. So everyone already has their bias. They already have their telos. They have their goal. They have an ideal in their head of what people should look like. A Christian is going to say, you know, people should look like the Mother Mary and Lord Jesus, and they should be humble, and they should be chaste, and they should be faithful and honest, and all these Christian values. And then someone who's already dead set, who already read Nietzsche, they're going to say, okay, I read Nietzsche. What period of history is closest to my Nietzschean ideal? Oh, well, that would be the Roman Empire. And therefore, that's what I mean when I talk about traditionalism. So in my mind, a lot of times when people say traditionalism, all they're saying is, I'm going to justify my already formed preconception, my already formed ideal, my already formed telos. I'm going to justify that by pointing to the past and saying, I define Nietzscheanism as traditionalism. I define Christianity as traditionalism. I define insert the blank here as traditionalism. And some people do this with classical liberalism. They'll say, well, the tradition of classical liberalism really goes back to rationalism, which goes back to the Greeks. So in a sense, classical liberalism and everything that it's born, you know, Marxism has come out of that tradition, humanism, atheism. You could say, well, that all goes back to Plato, and that is its own tradition. So again, a traditionalist could be a Nazi, it could be a Christian, it could be a Nietzschean pagan, it could be an atheist. An atheist could say, I'm legitimately in the tradition of Western civilization. I define Western civilization as Platonic Socratic civilization, a breakaway civilization that rejected superstition. And that is the tradition I'm a part of, the classical liberal tradition, going back to the ancient Greek skeptics and rationalists. So this whole, whenever someone says, I'm a traditionalist, already I'm skeptical of them because there's someone who's not clearly stating their ideas. They don't have a label. They don't have a word for who they are. They're vaguely appealing to traditionalism, and then after the fact, redefining tradition to fit whatever their preconceived notion is. So, yeah, that's generally, I think, you know, calling yourself a traditionalist is a bit like calling yourself a progressive. Well, what does that mean? What are we progressing towards? A progressive is someone who's progressing toward a goal. Well, why don't you just tell me your goal instead of calling yourself a progressive, because calling yourself a progressive is like, I am a do-gooder. Well, tell me your political philosophy. I am a do-gooder. Well, that doesn't tell me what you think is good and bad. I want to know your moral system. Tell me how you differentiate right from wrong. Well, I just do good and I don't do evil. Well, that doesn't tell me anything. Everyone thinks that they are a do-gooder, and everyone thinks they're progressive in the sense that they're progressing toward an ideal, whether they call themselves that or not. And everyone, even the progressives, even Antifa, even Marxists, are acting according to some tradition. I mean, even Marxists can look back and say, okay, well, the Greek philosophers were rejecting the skepticism of religious authority, and that was a good thing. And so we're acting in that tradition. We're bringing those axioms and those principles of skepticism and atheism, and we're projecting them out, and we're increasing them, and we're progressing toward a telos. But yeah, again, if someone calls themselves a progressive or someone calls themselves a traditionalist, I just don't see the content in that, and I see it's about as fluffy as someone saying, I'm a do-gooder. Well, we all think that we are do-gooders, but that doesn't really differentiate you from anyone else. So I guess we'll continue.
A society hell-bent on expansion and the preservation of one's own kind and culture at the detriment of all others.
The preservation of one's own culture. Well, what if I want to change the culture? What if I think the culture is not sufficient? What if I want to evolve the culture? And this idea of attacking other people's cultures or breaking down other people's cultures, I mean, from my perspective, it's like there's so much that we could learn from other people's cultures. There's so much that we could learn, and my perspective is that a dominant culture doesn't look necessarily to destroy other cultures. It actually looks to work within them. And if we think about the concept of leadership on an individual scale, a good leader is not someone who walks into a room of people and starts exterminating lesser people, okay? And in my mind, a good group of people, a good collective, is not a collective that goes around killing everybody else. A good collective is the collective that other people look up to and aspire to be. And so when the Chinese write books, self-help books, how to be like the Jewish people, they're admiring the Jewish people. They're saying, look at the Jewish people. They've been so successful. Let's try to figure out what values allow them to succeed, and let's be like them. Or if someone writes a book like How to Be Like a Mormon, How to Learn from the Mormons. Or if someone writes something that's, How to Be Like the Chinese, or How to Be Like the Tiger Moms, how to make your children just as successful as Asian children, how to keep them out of trouble, how to keep them out of gangs, how to keep them out of crime, how to have them achieve in school, how to have them, get into a good college. So if someone writes a book that says how to be like Jews, or how to be like Asians, or how to succeed like these people, that admiration of a collective, and saying, look up at those people, they're doing so well, maybe we should start acting like them. The Japanese had a period of modernization, and modernization was pretty much synonymous with westernization, meant being more like the West. They said, we're going to get crushed by the West. If we don't modernize, if we don't westernize, they're going to come here. So either we have to start adopting their customs, or they're going to come invade us. That's why Japanese businessmen wear suits. The suit is a Western European invention it's a European fashion. The Japanese adopted it voluntarily. They weren't forced to. They weren't colonized, but they adopted it voluntarily because they wanted to westernize. They wanted to understand the West. They wanted to institute Western reforms in culture and politics in their military so that they could compete with the Western world, because they saw the Westerners as powerful and themselves relatively as powerless. So they wanted to westernize. And that's generally what I see. When a group is successful, when it does well for itself, it tends not to wipe everyone else out, because it doesn't need to. A successful people doesn't wipe others out. It doesn't exclude other people. A successful people actually becomes a leader type people, a people who leads the way for other nations. This is how the ancient Israelites wrote about themselves. When you read the Torah, it says that The Jews should be a light unto other nations, that every goyim, every member of another nation should tug at the skirt of every Jew, that each Jew should be like a priest to 100 or 1,000 goyim, or whatever the ratio is. So that is the conception. Not that the Jews should necessarily go out and exterminate everyone, although, you can read about the Amalekites, and that's sort of an alternative thought, and the Torah is written by a number of authors, so it's not just one author. So there is a little bit of exterminationism in there, but there's also a concept of leadership. If you look at the Indo-European peoples, who in my mind have done a great deal to found the modern world, the Indo-Europeans didn't go around exterminating everyone they found. In all actuality, what the Indo-Europeans did is they went in, and they might have had some military conquest, they might win some battles or whatever, but after establishing their supremacy, they wouldn't exterminate everyone, they wouldn't exclude everyone. A lot of times they would incorporate a lot of the native culture, they would syncretize with the native culture, they would institute themselves as leaders, and then if there was talent among the local population, they would recruit the local population into the leadership class. And you see this over and over again in Indo-European societies, when we're looking at Greeks or Romans, when we're looking at the example of the British Isles. First you have a Celtic invasion. It's not that the Celts kill everyone and replace all the people with Celts, but they come in, they institute linguistic dominance, and so the British Isles become Celtic. And then what happens, the Anglo-Saxons come in. They don't kill all the Celts, they don't genetically wipe them out, but they come in, they institute linguistic dominance in the area we now know as Scotland and England and Cornwall. They have a kind of linguistic dominance, and they intermarry with the local population. They form a leadership class, a ruling class over the Celtic peoples. And then what happens after the Anglo-Saxons is the Normans come in. And the Normans actually are a funny example, because the Normans are originally Scandinavians who went to France, who learned how to speak French, and then after learning how to speak French, they went to Britain to conquer Britain, and they became a ruling class, and they spoke Norman French, and the masses of people at that time in England and Scotland spoke, instead of speaking Celtic, which was still spoken in Wales and Ireland and some parts of Scotland. But the Normans tried to encourage people a little bit to speak, because they had a Norman dominance, so either intentionally or unintentionally people would learn Norman, because that was the language of the ruling class. But a lot of people still spoke Anglo-Saxon, so ultimately there was a fusion of the two. So it's not that the Normans went in and exterminated everyone. I'm not saying it was totally peaceful. They went in there, they fought some battles, they established their dominance, but once they made clear who's in charge here, it was not an exclusivism in terms of people were killed for speaking Anglo-Saxon, and it was not an extermination campaign, it wasn't a genocide. They went in and they said, we're going to take the best of the population, and people from time to time could be knighted, they could be ennobled, they could be brought into the nobility. There could be marriages between people to bring them into the family line. So it wasn't necessarily a 100% exclusive thing. They'd go in and do that. So, the rhetoric of exclusivism and of monoculture, when we look at history, I can't think of a single culture where I would say that's a monoculture. Look at a single area, look at a single nation and say, oh, well, that's a monoculture. The German people, they're just German. Well, no. They've taken a great deal from the Romans. They've taken a great deal from the Greeks. Genetically, they've taken a great deal from Celtic peoples and Slavic peoples. So Germany, you can't just say it's a single German line, pure, unmixed with any other people. Culturally, Germans are mixed with all kinds of people. And again, we could do this with any group, not just Europeans, but any group. So it's not necessarily to deconstruct the distinctiveness of those nations. We can make that classification and say, well, here's a distinct culture. But to speak of monoculture in dogmatic ways doesn't really acknowledge the way necessarily that history works. And I guess we can continue in the same vein.
This is the only natural, sane response to a world filled with subhuman filth and degenerate leeches whose only goal in life is the extermination of everything just and pure.
Oh, subhuman leeches. Yeah, it is instinctual to kill leeches, right? Because our ancestors had to deal with parasites all the time. All the time, parasites would attack our bodies, and we instinctually want to kill them. And so if you compare people to leeches, kind of a genocidal way to go about things. The leech in itself, the leech is a parasite. That's how the leech lives. You can call the leech subhuman and say, well, the leech is below humanity. But time will tell which lasts longer, the leech or the human. We do know, certainly, that leeches came before humans. Doesn't mean that leeches are the ancestors of humans. But parasitism, if you think about the origins of humanity, the ancestors of humanity are ultimately rodents, and rodents essentially are derived from a species of small lizard that grew hair. And so this species of small lizard that grew hair became what we know as the mammals, and these early mammals pretty much looked like rats. Because if you're thinking ergonomically about the best, most versatile form of a mammal, the most versatile form of a mammal is pretty much a rat. And that's why rats survive in the most extreme scenarios. They survive on ships, they survive in basements, they survive in cold regions, they survive in hot regions. Rats are some of the most prolific mammals in the world. And one of the reasons for that is, like the crocodile or the alligator, they're one of the most ancient forms of a mammal. Now, we know about rats. Rats are essentially parasites. Right? Rats go into your food and they steal your food. That's parasitism. They don't go on the farm and make their own food. And they're not a predator. They're not like a hawk. They're not like an eagle. They're not like a snake. They're not like a T-Rex. They don't go around with their big claws and hunt down their prey. Most of the time they're eating garbage. They're eating trash. And that was even true back in dinosaur times, that dinosaurs would die. A T-Rex would eat most of the corpse. He'd eat 90% of the corpse, and then these rat-like mammals would come along and they'd finish off the corpse. They were scavengers, and scavengers are a type of, you could call that a type of parasitism. They're benefiting off the work of others. Now, in that parasitism, they're not necessarily harming. You could say, well, that's not technically parasitism, it's mutualism, because they're not harming the dead animal because it's already dead. They're not harming the T-Rex because they're not attacking the T-Rex. The T-Rex didn't want the last 10%, couldn't digest that or whatever, can't eat the big bones, so the rats go in and they chew off the bones. But this is what humanity is descended from. So to even make the suggestion to say that somehow someone who is a parasite is lower, they're subhuman. The equivocation between being subhuman and being a parasite, you've already made a moral claim. You've already made a moral statement without backing it up, and that's fine. But let's be clear what's going on here. You've already bought into a moral framework. We're like 30 seconds into the video, and we're making moral claims, but we're disguising them through nasty rhetoric or offensive rhetoric. And not understanding plainly, just unemotionally, what's going on here, is that you're suggesting that the parasitic strategy is an invalid strategy. And if we were to classify this in terms of the three types that I talk about all the time, or the three classes, the warrior, the priest, the merchant, the closest to the parasite would be the merchant. The merchant is someone who sees an opportunity where there's 1% off the top or 1% off the bottom. 1% off the top is usually, we've got a situation where someone needs to make an initial investment into a factory. The capitalist comes on, he makes that initial investment, he takes the risk, and he skims off 1% off the top of all the profits. And that's how he makes his money. He makes an initial investment, and then he reaps what he sows. And you could call that a type of parasitism. In that sense, you could even describe all agriculture and all farming as a form of parasitism off the earth, where you lay your seeds, you let them do all the work, you let them grow, and then when they're ready to harvest, you go and you eat them all. So you could describe that as a type of parasitism. Pastoralism you could describe as a type of parasitism, where really the animals are doing all the work, grazing, gathering that energy that's stored from the sun, and then when they're ready to kill, you kill them and you eat them. So really it sort of depends on the way you're looking at this, but this ethos of you have to create something for yourself, you have to do everything yourself, you can never skim off the top, you can't ever take off the margins. This and the concept of like anti-usury, being against merchandising, being against parasitism, anti-usury comes from people who, they don't want a risk-based economy. A risk-based economy requires that you have people with capital who are able to choose what they're going to invest in or not. If you don't have the ability for investment and then the reward being interest, essentially, a capitalist makes an investment in a factory and then gains 1% interest every year, or it could be exorbitant interest, it could be 10%, I don't know. But that kind of interest, if you don't have that kind of reward mechanism, we can look at the Muslim world as an example of a place where usury is pretty much banned. Officially, technically it's banned. Now there's ways to get around that, and if you look at the history of Baghdad as a city, very important pivotal city, the top merchants in Baghdad always have been, basically up until the founding of Israel, they were always disproportionately Jewish. So you can look at the history of Jewish merchants in Baghdad. So this argument that Jews are not an elite outside of Ashkenazi Jews, it's just Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardim have never been an elite, that's just wrong. Sephardim are and were an elite in the city of Baghdad in Iraq. Of course, the fact that we could talk about the Sephardi IQ and why would that be lower than the Ashkenazi IQ and blah blah blah. The fact of the matter is that that you have backing up, getting to the moral point, getting away from that historical tangent, just the idea of attacking merchandisers as parasites, as leeches. What people don't understand when you're doing that, you are saying that the warrior morality is the only valid morality. Any other kind of morality is an invalid morality, it's a disgusting morality, it's a subhuman morality. And we have to really understand the consequences of that thinking. In light of technological changes, does this thinking, this extreme kind of thinking, is that going to be sustainable going into the 21st century? So that would be my question. Let's continue on.
Something greater than the slave-like morality imposed upon us by alien religions, a society built on unshakable, indelible foundations woven from our own stock and governed by the light of apotheosis.
Rejecting alien ideas. I don't know if alien ideas work, if foreign ideas work. Ultimately, the past and the future are foreign lands. If we go back to the past, that's a foreign place with foreign ideas, a foreign situation. I'm sure people who talk about, I'm so intolerant and I'm so authoritarian and I believe in tyranny. If you go back in the past, I'm sure you get ripped apart. I mean, just look at the Neanderthals. You just look at the skeletons. And these were stocky guys. I mean, just for reference, if you try to fight a gorilla, the gorilla will literally take both of your arms and hand and rip you apart. I don't care how strong you are. I don't care if you're the MMA fighter of the century or whatever. There's a physical strength difference there. Even a chimpanzee can actually rip your arm out of your socket. I mean, they can bite you in the face, and they have like fangs, and they can bite you in the face and rip off your face. And chimpanzee is one of the closest relatives of humankind. So if you want to look at the Neanderthals, now the Neanderthals had bigger brains than we do today. And the Neanderthals, they were stockier, they were stronger. They're a little bit shorter than we are today. But so are chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are a great deal shorter, and Neanderthals were also shorter. But they were stockier and they were stronger. And so if you went back to Neanderthal times, and of course, if you're of non-sub-Saharan African ancestry, you have Neanderthal admixture. If you go back to your ancient Neanderthal ancestors, they'd tear you limb from limb. So the past really is a foreign land. If we go back far enough, we're going to find a foreign land. Does that mean that the past was false, that the past was wrong? Well, in some cases, yes, but in other cases, no. So just because something is foreign, just because something is alien, doesn't mean it's false or wrong. On the other hand, just because something is futuristic, certainly the future is going to be a different place than today, and if we traveled into the future, we'd certainly see a foreign land, an alien land, a different land, perhaps with a different language, different ways of speaking, different ways of communicating, different ideas. It doesn't necessarily mean it's all right, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's all wrong. So this idea that anything that's alien and foreign must be wrong and evil and bad, and we should get rid of it and burn it with fire and be fanatical, just like Warhammer 40K type fascism, just totally closed-minded to other ideas. Look, I'm for skepticism. I'm not for just accepting any random idea off the street. I'm not for, oh, well, it's foreign, so it must be good. It's alien, so it must be good. But turning around and doing the exact opposite seems to be a Hollywood cartoon of a villain.
You know, when you deepen your voice like this, and you start talking about how we're going to bring in the fascist, intolerant, fanatical religion of Nietzsche and the will of power.
And you do that voice, I don't know, it seems kind of ridiculous to me. Seems like a Hollywood villain. Seems like you're imitating Thanos, so you're just imitating, you know, some cartoonish, you know, Hitler is getting up and he's talking about how Germans are starving in the streets and how Germany's going to be great again. And he's up there and he's ranting and he's raving. But you don't understand what he's saying in German. And they can put any caption down there. They can do any translation. They can talk about the master race, right? We're going to be the master race. You take that out of context, that little snippet, and it's like you've taken the evil villain role and you've sort of taken it on and you've embraced it. Just because there are women, essentially women, who will go out and they'll say anything that is foreign is superior to anything that is familiar. You know, foreign food is better than domestic food. Foreign men are better than familiar men. There are women out there who will say things like, you'll have white women who say, I don't date white men. And you could hear it if you look out on the internet, you find these, and this is not a common white woman, this is like 1% of 1%. But there are white women who will say, I don't like dating white men because it's like dating my brother or something, or dating a cousin, and I only date black men. Well, certainly there are people who think like that, but just because they're crazy people who are so autophobic, there's another, oikophobic, I think is the term that's been coined. Fear of one's own, fear of that which is familiar. Some people are so oikophobic and they're so xenophilic that they will not date within their race and they have to date outside their race. And we can see that as silly and ridiculous, but to go the extreme exact opposite and to say, if it's not founded within our eternal, unshakable ideas, then we must reject it as alien and foreign, we must burn it with fire. Yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. That's not really adherence to the truth, is it? That's not really an evolutionary outlook. To take one stupid extreme and then flip to another stupid extreme doesn't seem to be very intelligent. Isn't there some kind of Aristotelian mean here? Or to me, it's not even an Aristotelian mean. I mean, if someone says, you have 5 fingers, you can keep 5 of them, or we can cut off 5 of them, I don't say, well, the Aristotelian mean means I get 2 fingers and half of a thumb. That's obviously another stupid. So taking even the concept of an Aristotelian mean to its extreme makes it stupid. It makes it foolish. We can make light of the Aristotelian mean in that way. And so we can criticize things and we can be skeptical and we can break them down and we can compare them, and we can't simply take the median of every 2 ideas. We can't simply take thesis, antithesis, and median. So the synthesis is not going to be the median of the 2 ideas. We have to empirically test it against the present reality. We have to compare it to historical reality, and then we also have to do the job of trying to project the future reality, because unlike the past, our ancestors' environment didn't change very much from year to year. The metaphysics of it didn't really change very much. We're living in a time of really a shifting sort of a metaphysic in terms of human culture, or you could say a metacultural shift. That technology is changing the global context in which culture exists, and so we have to do the job of sort of projecting trends outward. We're going to see more anonymity, more individuality, more atomization. That those trends are going to continue, and so we can't do what our ancestors did, is where they say, okay, well, maybe we're going to have a colder winter next year, or maybe some foreign tribe is going to come invade us. But the basic facts of life didn't change from year to year. We're living in a time when the basic facts of life are sort of changing. I mean, it used to be that if you wanted to be a powerful nation, you had to have a lot of babies. Today, America's the most powerful nation on the face of the planet. It's not the one with the highest fertility. That used to be the case. It used to be the case that the nations with the highest fertility also had the greatest military power. So Africa used to not be the continent with the highest fertility. It actually used to be that Europe had the highest fertility, because that was sort of an iron law of demography, that the more children you have, the more soldiers you have. The more soldiers you have, the bigger your army. The bigger your army, the more military power you have. Technology has changed the relationship between childbirth and military power, and that's fundamentally changed the way that we look at gender. Before, the gender roles were a military necessity. You could not survive from a military perspective. You couldn't survive as a state or a nation if you didn't have patriarchal authoritarian gender roles. It's not the case today in terms of a military context. So if we're looking at things through a warrior frame, through a Paleolithic frame, we're going to be coming to conclusions that might not apply in the present day, or they might even apply less so into the future. So we have to recognize the context we're coming from. This is a Paleolithic warrior-style perspective. And if we don't identify and name it for what it is, and that's why I refer to formalism, then we're never going to figure out what's actually going on.
That driving, all-consuming framework of beliefs that man is his own God, that he is God, the keeper of his destiny, noble by birth, master by choice, a tyrant by need, a ruler by right.
Yeah, this is very Nietzschean. It's very anti-Christian to me. It's very anti-traditional. I mean, if we think about many different great cultures of the world, including European cultures, including East Asian cultures, including the Mayas, the Aztecs, the Incas, we know that humanity has generally conceived of higher beings, higher spiritual beings than themselves. Now, in some cases, we could look at the Norse and we could say, well, Odin was really just the ancestor of the Norse. He wasn't some immortal being. All the Aesir, all the Norse gods were actually technically mortal. They could die. But they were higher in the sense that they represented ideal virtues. So, from my perspective, identifying man as God, that sort of humanism, is very progressive. It's not very traditional at all. It's not very idealistic to define yourself as God, to define man as God. And I think most successful cultures, most great civilizations throughout history have always had higher ideals, whether that manifested as immortal gods or, in the example of Buddhism, you have the Buddha, who was a historical figure, who then sort of became deified in the religion of Buddhism, although Buddhists will tell you, Buddha is not a god, he's not even a prophet, he's just a man of great teaching, he just teaches us a lot of wisdom. But, the concept that the person himself is God, or that man himself is God, is sometimes an esoteric teaching. It's sometimes something that, you would see in terms of the concept of the Brahmin. The Brahmin want to ascend to that state of nirvana. They want to ascend up the chain of being to some point where they're merging with divinity. And so we can see that concept with the Roman Caesar, that Caesar himself was a kind of godlike figure. So certainly in an esoteric upper echelon of things, you might see this this concept emerging that man himself can sort of ascend to the level of a deity. But for most people, for the exoteric side of religion, most of the time you do have a distinction between divine and mortal, or God and man. You have that distinction there, and man doesn't worship himself. That kind of humanism actually seems to have a lot in common with Antifa. If you asked Antifa, what's the closest thing you have to God? I think they would say ourselves. We worship ourselves. We worship our fat acceptance. We accept our fatness as divine. We worship our cummies acceptance. We worship our own lust as divine. We worship our entertainment acceptance. If we want to smoke weed, that's divine. If we want to experience pleasure, that's divine. If we want to watch Rick and Morty, that's divine. And most of them would probably not put it in this way, but if you had to force them to sort of say, if there is any divinity out there, is it like some God above you, or is it you yourself? And they would say, the most spiritual thing in the world, if they believe in any kind of spirituality, if you could force them into making any kind of statement about spirituality, they would probably point to their own desires, their own pleasures, their own hedonism as the highest form of spirituality. And if not for themselves, then they would say, I'm not selfish, I'm not a capitalist, I believe everyone should have access to weed, and everyone should have free Rick and Morty streaming, and everyone should have unlimited porn. So that, to me, is the conclusion of identifying the mass man with God. And so that teaching, I think, is ultimately a dangerous teaching. I think anytime you have a teaching like man is God, you also have to have some sort of teaching that God really is above man, and that God is unattainable. I think that's something that Christianity does quite well, is that, they say that God became man, and so there is a divinity about humanity, and Judaism says that as well, that humans were made in the image of God, so there's a connection between man and divinity. There's sort of a lifeline there, where there's some kind of tether or a string, or there's some kind of ethereal attachment between man and God, that perhaps we can try to bridge that. And the Bible talks about the Tower of Babel as being a physical tower trying to ascend unto heaven. So we can see that esoteric teaching there, even in the Garden of Eden, where it's said that there are plural gods, not just Yahweh, but there are plural gods, and that the gods are afraid that Adam will ascend to godhood. He'll ascend to immortality if he eats of the fruit of the garden. He's going to ascend with the knowledge of good and evil, ascend with a knowledge of morality and the subjectivity of morality. He's going to become like unto the gods, and that brings fear to the gods, and so they want to cast him out of the Garden of Eden. So there's that esoteric teaching that's there in a lot of different religions. It's there in Buddhism, it's there in Christianity, it's there in Judaism, perhaps in Sufi Islam. Again, I haven't looked a lot into Sufi Islam. Partially because Islam, apparently a majority of Muslims believe in gay marriage in the United States, which, if you're looking to convert to Islam, just one more reason not to look into that. But anyway, yeah, that esoteric teaching is there a lot, but to me it has to be paired with an exoteric teaching that really God is above man, and that God is something that we're striving toward, and we can't call ourselves gods. We can't make this assumption that we're perfect just the way that we are, because when we start identifying with God and we start going down that humanist route of worshiping ourselves and worshiping the self, that's the moment in which you start to get into self-acceptance. You start to get into, humanism and all of the things I just listed.
We tamed this world once, we can do it again. But first, we must silence the heretic, outcast the mutant, and purge the unclean, and then, when we've freed ourselves of weakness, empathy, remorse, and guilt, and when the last subhuman has been cleansed from Earth and the last trace of their existence purged from this planet, then we will ascend to the stars and make them our own.
So we're talking about purging heretics. Well, I'm a heretic. I say things that other people don't agree with. So, purging heretics is not on my list of things that I want to do or like to do. If someone has a different opinion, let's talk about it. I favor freedom of speech. Because there's a lot of things in this world where we don't have freedom. For instance, you don't have freedom of property because we have limited property. There's a limited amount of real estate on the world. Let's say I want a beachfront property. Well, there's really only so many miles of beachfront property. Let's say I want beachfront property that's close to a major global city. Well, again, if you want beachfront property that's near a major global city, there's a limited amount of that. And so not everyone can attain that goal if that's your goal. So a lot of things on the planet Earth or within our reality, a lot of things are limited, and therefore we can't have infinite freedom. We can't just give out infinite amounts of any given thing. Or something like love. Everyone can't be loved equally, or everyone can't receive infinite love because each individual person only has so much love to give. And so, if I want infinite love and you want infinite love, and there's only so many people in the world, there's only so much that we can experience and perceive and give and receive and so on. So there's a lot of things in this world which are limited. Freedom of speech is one of these areas where we actually do have a much greater deal of natural freedom, you might say, or metaphysical freedom, in the sense that words don't necessarily have to cancel one another out. If I want a beachfront property on 22nd Street or wherever it is, if I want the beachfront property, then I exclude others necessarily from having that exact same property. If I want some specific item, then a lot of times I'm sort of excluding other people from having that thing. But if I want my own freedom of speech, I'm not necessarily excluding anyone else from having theirs. Freedom of speech is one of these great things where, unlike a lot of things in life, most things in life are limited. Most things in life have a limited supply. If we're talking about anything that's made with effort. So if I want a fancy car, well, that car takes time, resources, energy, and effort to create, and there's only so much limited hours in a day. So it takes time to create the fancy car. And so that there's a limited supply going into the creation of that car. That means it's limited. So I'm going to take the car. Well, someone else may have wanted it, but I paid the higher price. I won it in the auction, so I get it. So a lot of things in life are involving winners and losers. A lot of things in life are not, everybody can't win. Not everyone can get a medal just for participating. Freedom of speech is one of those great areas where we do have a lot more room to maneuver in terms of allowing different people to say what they want to say. Now, there are limits on that, of course, in terms of the promotion of violence, in terms of the incitement to violence, because then you start getting into excluding people. The second you start talking about silencing other people's voices, well, then a paradox sort of a paradox forms in the freedom of speech. If you advocate for, if you say, I want to censor this person, or you start talking about violence or anything like that, a paradox forms, because then you negate the freedom of speech of other people. So, freedom of speech itself does, encounter its own limits, but it is an area where I say, hey, there's a lot more natural freedom here built into the concept of speech than there is built into the concept of the acquisition of private property or material goods or something like that. Or, if Germany is a certain size, then and it wants to get bigger, well, that sort of comes at the expense of Poland, or it comes at the expense of France. So a lot of things in life are limited, and there's a winner and there's a loser. With freedom of speech, I can say whatever I want, and if you want to say whatever you want, that doesn't necessarily preclude, we don't really negate one another's ability to speak. Whereas in terms of imperialism, you're negating one nation's size for the benefit of another nation's size, or with material, if you have two companies that are in competition, two restaurants next door to another, and one succeeds, then the other tends to fail. Sometimes there can be cooperation. You can have two restaurants, one's Chinese and the other is Italian. And so you have a successful Italian restaurant, and then people like to go to that restaurant, and that sort of draws business and increases the price of real estate for the Chinese restaurants, so they can benefit from one another. So I'm not saying that everything is a winner-take-all scenario in life, but free speech is one of those special areas where I'd say, hey, look, if we can we can err on the side of being a little more tolerant here, then at least we have the opportunity to do so. And in this current situation, any talk about banning heretics or burning heretics or getting rid of empathy, no, I want people to empathize with me. Look, I'm going to make an effort to empathize with other people, because what I'm encountering is a world in which, I have problems, I have concerns, and people don't want to empathize with me. So when I hear people who watch my videos or they say that they support what I do, and then they go out and they talk about excluding other people, they talk about eliminating heretics, they talk about what's the other phrase that's used? Just kind of like witch trials and these sort of things. I'm like, look, even if you really believe in this stuff, which I think there's a great case to be made for it, this isn't really good in the long run. We need an evolutionary mindset. We need to be tolerant. We need to be open. That's what made Western civilization great in the first place, going back to Plato and Socrates, that we had an ability to criticize ourselves, we had an ability to be self-aware, we had an ability to break with tradition, to think outside the box. So I think that's a great ability, and we shouldn't let go of that in favor of fanaticism and intolerance. And a lot of people who have found this, not Richard Kalergi, the father of Richard Kalergi. I'm going to look up his name real quick. And then the other guy, Nietzsche talks about, you sort of have to break with the past. You have to overcome humanity. His father was Heinrich Kalergi. So Heinrich Kalergi was a man who, his big beef with Judaism is that he found Judaism to be too intolerant. And he spoke out against anti-Semitism because he said, look, intolerance is ultimately a Jewish concept, and we should not be intolerant. And so therefore we need to tolerate Jewish people, because if we don't tolerate Jewish people, then we're going to embrace the intolerance of the Old Testament. So this concept that tolerance is a foundational value of Western civilization goes back to Rudolf II, and I have a video on him you can watch. So, in terms of the power of Western civilization, the power of Western civilization doesn't seem to be burning the heretic and eliminating alien and foreign ideas. So this sort of really basic when Trump was like, it photoshopped his head onto like a Warhammer 40K meme, that sort of thing to me seems to be a little juvenile, a little infantile, a little bit divorced from the actual history of Western civilization.
It's a pretty good speech, right? I mean, if you were listening to this in 1940 in Germany, you'd probably get pretty excited and think, you're on the right side of history. You're the hero. You're going to go fight for what's right. And
if I was listening to this in 1940s Germany, I'm not sure I would feel that excited. If you actually read a speech from 1940s Germany, a little bit different. Actually sort of talks about specific events, specific things that are going on. Doesn't really talk a lot about going to space. Not a lot of talk about burning heretics or excluding people. It's a little more specific. Most of it actually is positive rather than negative. Rather than talking about we have to destroy all these subhumans, it's more stuff like, it's time for the German people to rise up and defend Europe. We need to defend Europe from atheism. We need to defend Europe from barbarism. We need to start sacrificing for the greater good, for our not only our common nationhood, but our common civilization, our continental solidarity. We need to develop Europe. We need to develop Eastern Europe. We need to rebuild. is a big theme that you're going to hear. Rebuilding Europe from the catastrophe of war. We need to end this war as soon as possible because war is a terrible thing. We've got people making brave sacrifices. We have to honor their sacrifices. We have to remember the struggle of the common people, of the women who are making sacrifices in the war. We have to remember the sacrifices of the average person, the average worker, and that the war, really, the brunt of the sacrifice is not being borne by the leaders. It's not being borne by, the diplomats or the politicians or the generals. Really, the people who are suffering in this war is the common person, the mother who loses her son, the father who has to go off to war. So really the common person is the one who is suffering in the war, and that is the justification that was made of let's end this war as soon as possible so that we can alleviate the suffering that war causes, that we have to stand in solidarity because, if we don't win this war, then ultimately Europe is going to descend into atheism and barbarism, and our civilization will be extinguished. We have to fight for the truth. We have to fight for justice for all peoples. We're not doing this to go exterminate people. You're never going to hear a 1940s German speech where they talk about we have to exterminate these subhumans. Now, I'm not denying that language was used in other cases. You might find some sort of military order which has a reference to subhumans. You might have a military order that refers to Ausrottung, to extermination, rooting out of peoples. There were certainly orders where in the case of Heydrich, who was he was the leader of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. He was assassinated. In response, there was a military order that went out and said, let's destroy a Czech village. We're just going to kill all the women and children and the men that are in that village. We're going to exterminate about 400 people for no reason other than a revenge action, a retribution action. So things like that did happen. But that wasn't the speech. When people would go out and make speeches to the German people, they wouldn't talk about going to space. They wouldn't talk about how we need to exterminate people. They wouldn't talk about burning heretics. They wouldn't talk about, really, that had nothing to do with what was going on. It was mostly, this is a fight for survival. We're fighting for the survival of our people. We're fighting for the survival of Europe. In fact, we're fighting for civilization and truth in general. We're fighting against atheism and barbarism. We're fighting against materialism. We are sacrificing, we're struggling so that we can end this war as soon as possible, because a war is not really a good thing. So again, if you actually read the speeches instead of copying the Hollywood projection, instead of, I guess you can go watch a Star Wars movie and listen to the speech by the bad guy, like Darth Vader or whoever, or you can listen to a Thanos speech, and you can, derive all kinds of misconceptions about what the actual content or the substance of a 1940s German wartime speech would be. But there's a lot of misconceptions here.
On the internet, the alt-right is basically, it's like they're all thinking this speech that I gave you and they don't want to say it.
I'm not really thinking the speech that you gave. I'm not really pumped up about burning heretics, because that's what I hear Elizabeth Warren saying. When Elizabeth Warren says, when I become president, I will use the full executive power to destroy every last vestige of white nationalism, what I hear is, any white heretics are going to be burned at the stake by, the head Puritan prohibition officer Elizabeth Warren. So I don't like this idea of burning heretics. I like the idea where, hey, we're going to have a society in which we can tolerate different ideas, tolerate different opinions, and of course there's a problem. There's a problem when people are forced to be in an environment that they don't want to be in, and I would say, okay, well, allow for freedom of association. Allow for people to freely associate. I wouldn't say, hey, look, if someone doesn't want to work or live or sit next to someone who has an entirely different worldview, an entirely different experience, entirely different identity, then I would say, well, if you force people together, you are going to have a kind of a balkanized situation. You're going to have a situation that, well, diversity plus proximity equals conflict. But that's not necessarily a consequence of freedom of thought. You know, again, Europe under Rudolf II and other quasi-Masonic or Kabbalistic, or you could even, you know, say he, in some way, he had New Age thinking. He was an astrologer. He was into alchemy. These types of people, he wasn't the first, he certainly wasn't the last. And these types of people were very tolerant. They were tolerant of Judaism and Catholicism and Protestantism and Islam. They were very tolerant. And they looked into all different kinds of systems. And in fact, if you look at the history of Nazism, who wrote Mein Kampf? Well, everyone was going to say Hitler, right? But who actually wrote the words of Mein Kampf? Because Hitler didn't sit down and write it. He dictated Mein Kampf. He dictated it while he was in prison, because at the end of the day, Hitler was a speaker and he wasn't a writer. And this was a common practice, actually, if you're writing a book or any other number of things, is you would have a secretary who would transcribe what you would dictate. And transcription was a very important job, and a lot of people would be trained in transcription and writing. And his secretary at the time was Rudolf Hess. So Rudolf Hess would go every day to prison with Hitler, and he would sit down in a chair, and Hitler would pace back and forth in the prison cell, and Hess would sit there and he would transcribe little notes in shorthand, which is sort of a skill we've lost today, but he would transcribe notes that became Mein Kampf. Now, who was Rudolf Hess's biggest mentor? Again, a question someone's going to instantly answer, oh, it was Hitler. No, it actually wasn't Hitler. The person who formed Rudolf Hess's worldview and who gave Rudolf Hess the idea that Germany needs a messiah, it needs a leader, he essentially had the ideology of National Socialism before he met Hitler, and then he met Hitler, and he's like, whoa, I wrote this essay about how Germany needs a new leader, and it seems that this Adolf guy has all the qualities that we need. So he already came to the viewpoint of National Socialism before Hitler even came along. And who was Rudolf Hess's mentor? It was Karl Haushofer. Karl Haushofer was an Orientalist. It means he studied the Far East. He wasn't about burning heretics. He wasn't about killing anything alien or foreign. He was into studying foreign cultures, and he was a professor, and he was part of his teaching and part of his academic study was into geopolitics. So he's very interested in the question of how could Germany survive and thrive as a nation geopolitically. And he was very interested in looking at Eastern Europe as a space where Germany could colonize and develop in the same way that Britain had colonized North America and Africa, France had colonized Africa and the Middle East, Italy had its own colonies, Belgium had colonies, the Netherlands had colonies, Denmark had colonies. Okay, so all these different European countries had colonies. We can even say that Russia had colonies in Siberia. So Karl Haushofer comes up with this idea. He also had other ideas, but that was his big claim to fame. And that was the person who formed Hess's early ideology. Then he met Hitler and he said, hey, Hitler is a great person who could become a leader of Germany. He has all the necessary qualities. He has great charisma, great speaking abilities. And so we have to wonder what went on in that little prison with Hitler and Hess. Was it just Hitler dictating ideas, or was it more of a communication? Was it more of a back and forth? Was it more of a discussion? I wasn't there. I don't know. But I can tell you that Rudolf Hess got his ideas from Karl Haushofer. He didn't get them from Hitler. He met Hitler and he said, wow, this guy is a perfect guy for the job. So I'm going to follow him. He's the good leader. But he already had all these ideas to begin with. Rudolf Hess was very pro-British, by the way. There's a huge struggle, huge split in the Nazi Party between Hess, who was extremely pro-British, who was on the same side as Hitler. Hitler was also very pro-British. On the other side, you had people like Goebbels and Stens, In the 1936 book Hitler, a Biography, German historian Konrad Hayden remarked that within the Sturmabteilung ranks there were large numbers of communists and social democrats. Many of the stormtroops were called beefsteaks, brown on the outside and red within. The number of beefsteaks was large in some cities in northern Germany, where the influence of Gregor Strasser and Strasserism were significant. So all of that is to say that Strasserism and the beefsteaks and all these people, they were really more friendly to Russia than they were to Britain. To give you some actual numbers here, Rudolf Diels, who was head of the Gestapo from 1933 to 1934, reported that 70% of new Sturmabteilung recruits had been communists in the city of Berlin. That's coming from a book by Timothy Brown, published 2009, called Weimar Radicals, Nazis and Communists Between Authenticity and Performance. Other historians maintain that both the SA and the SS were rife with Marxist, socialists, and social democrats. Historian Peter H. Merkel writes, "The utopians and those who speak of a Marxist republic have the highest membership in the SA and SS, 77.6 and 63% respectively." And that's in his book published in 1975, Political Violence Under the Swastika, 581 Early Nazis. So yeah, there was a huge controversy within the Nazi Party between people who favored an alliance with Russia. There was a big trend, and you can read David Irving's book, his biography of Goebbels, to see that Goebbels really did favor an alliance with Russia, as incredible as that sounds today, seeing as Hitler decided to go to war with Russia. But that was a strong trend. And ultimately, it was people like Rudolf Hess and Hitler himself who said, no, we're going to side against Russia, we're going to go for Britain. And that's something ultimately they had to take people like Goebbels and convince them otherwise. The people who couldn't be convinced, people like the Strasser brothers, they were essentially thrown out of the party. Other people like Himmler, Goering were again more on the pro-British side. So, yeah, that difference between the pro-British side, the pro-Russian side, was an important thing. Going back to Hess, Hess was mentored by Karl Haushofer. And a lot of these people were Orientalists. They studied other cultures. So this concept of monoculturalism doesn't seem like a strong cultural concept. When I look at the success of the Jewish people, it seems to be because they're able to sort of take the best from every culture. They take a little bit of Hammurabi's code, they take a little bit of Akhenaten's monotheism, some Zoroastrian monotheism, they take a little bit from the Canaanites, they take a little bit from the Phoenicians, they then move to Europe and they take a little bit from the Europeans, and they take sort of the best from each culture, they learn from each culture, and they use that to gain power and authority and dominance. Many cultures that are powerful and strong seem to be the crossroads of many different cultures. If you look at China, China is not a monoculture. In the north, you had the Manchu dynasty, who are not Han Chinese. You have the Hakka people. You have different sort of Mongol influence. You have a Japanese influence. And you look at are the Japanese a monoculture? Well, no. The Japanese are influenced by the Chinese, who then have all their multicultural, and of course, the whole concept of a Japanese businessman wearing a suit, that's Western fashion. So I can't name a single powerful culture in the world that is a monoculture. Every powerful culture seems to be a multicultural, it has some kind of multicultural ancestry. It's taking from the best of many different things. You know, if we look at the Nordic people, they didn't have two-story houses. They didn't have big stone colosseums like the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks and the Romans were traveling around. They were exploring. They were encountering different peoples. They were learning from all different peoples. If you go to Rome, in the ancient world, they would say, who are the best teachers? Who are the best craftsmen? Who are the best artisans? Who are the best philosophers? It's not us. It's not the Romans. It's the Greeks. So they had the concept of different nations have different specialities, and simply looking inward and saying, oh, well, we're the best and we're going to promote ourselves, that wasn't exactly, of course, there is a concept of cultural chauvinism or promoting your own culture, imperialism, expanding outward, but it had nothing to do with burning the heretics. That kind of intolerance would have been really foreign to Romans to a large degree, Greeks to a large degree. They wouldn't say, okay, you don't have to burn your idols. That's really the only religion I can think of that did that was the Jews. The Jews would go into an area and they'd say, you have to burn all your idols, we're going to kill all your livestock, kill all your children, because you've been worshiping some different god than Yahweh. But most people other than the Jews have not been intolerant. They've not been about burning heretics. So yeah, that concept, I would really caution people against wholeheartedly adopting that sort of concept.
It just seems like, okay, my options, according to my friends, are make money, fuck bitches, play video games, repeat. And I think there's more to be done. Like, I don't think we can just sit back, let the culture go wherever it's going to go.
So I can agree with this. I can agree that just being satisfied with the culture as it is very problematic, which is why I'm not a cultural preservationist. I'm not a traditionalist. I don't just look at something and say, well, that's mine, that's me, I identify with it, therefore it's perfect, don't change it, leave it the way it is. I say, let's have our allegiance be to the truth, and we have to understand our environment's changing all the time, and therefore our culture is going to have to change in order to adapt with the changing environment. That wasn't necessarily true for our ancestors, but it certainly is true for us. So we can't be complacent with the way the culture is. The culture is very destructive because it's running on instincts that don't necessarily serve us because our environment has changed. Those instincts developed in a completely different environment. We can't rely on our instinct for hunger to help us maintain a healthy body because otherwise we'll be obese. We can't rely on our instinct for lust to give us a healthy, sexual or marital life because, we didn't evolve to live in the sexual free-for-all of the 1960s and the sexual revolution. We can't rely on past instincts of nationalism and xenophobia and racism. We can't just instinctually rely on that. We have to use our brains. We have to look at the situation. We have to judge it for what it is and say, well, is this true? Is it not true? What evidence can we use? When can we rely on authority? When should we criticize authority? We have to use our brains on this one. So yeah, I agree, we should be critical, and to me that's the function of the left. The left is what comes in is it looks at the established power structure and it says, hey, let's hold up on burning the heretics here. Okay, because right now the heretics are the sexists and the racists and the misogynists. Let's cut out with the burning of heretics and the shaming of people who don't go along with your established dogma. Let's actually look at where the culture's going, where society's going. Let's critique it, and let's try to come up with a new solution. To me, that evolutionary way of thinking is really a non-dogmatic way of thinking, or relatively so. Again, I think metaphysically you can't be entirely without dogma, but certainly it's a sliding scale. You can be more dogmatic or less dogmatic, and the left tends to be less dogmatic. And I think right now we're at a point where technology is changing so fast we cannot afford to be fascistly dogmatic. We can't afford that, because if we're wrong, then the technology is going to continue to change society. We're going to be stuck in the past. We're not going to go anywhere. If we're stuck in a Martin Luther King speech from 50 or 60 years ago, and we're trying to apply the words of Martin Luther King to the present day, but the present day, everything's shifted so much. There's a population explosion in Africa. We're going to have 4 billion Africans at the end of the century. China is increasing in power. India is increasing in power. Europe is declining. Europe is aging. We're having a huge global demographic revolution. We have to really understand white people are going to be a minority, going from being 37% of the global population just down to a mere 3% of the global population, really closer to Ashkenazi Jews than, say, Africans or Chinese or Indians or anything like that. Not going to be a global dominant demographic population in terms of being a plurality or even a majority within many countries anymore. So we have to understand that's the future we're headed toward. And instead of going berserk and killing random innocent people, I think we should think carefully and consciously about this. We should be critical. We should take a leftist approach where you say, hey, things are changing. We might need to reformulate. Sure, all men are created equal. Well, that was the motto of the country to an extent. It might not have been the official motto, but it was part of the cultural mythos for a long time. Maybe we need to reevaluate that, really see if that's working for us or if it's going to serve us well in the future. Or something like, judge by the content of the character, not the color of the skin. Again, that worked back in the 1960s for a while. It seemed to be okay. Is that tenable? Is that sustainable, though, if we project it into the future? These types of questions, I think we should be critical of these dogmatic aphorisms. We should try to analyze what are the axiomatic features of our cultural mythology, and we should turn it on its head and invert it and criticize it and look at it in a skeptical way. And if we look historically, that's what people like Socrates did. That's what people like Voltaire did. That's what Rudolph II did. And all of these people, I would say, relative to their times, they were leftists. They criticized the power structure. They criticized authority. They certainly weren't into banning or censoring or burning heretics or anything like that. It seems to be the exact opposite of what I would see as a solution here.
All that involves, really, the only step that needs to be taken first is the opposite of multiculturalism. We need a monoculturalistic area, at least. When I say we, I'm really only talking about me, my wife, and my unborn child, right? It's not even late enough that it can be considered, human, right? But
I'll criticize again this right-wing dogma of monoculturalism. I'm looking at a future where I'm going to be part of 3%, of 1%, of this percent, of that percent. I'm a global minority. If you're watching the video, you're probably a global minority. There is no global majority. And in an environment of globalism, internationalism, we're all becoming more interconnected. In that environment, you cannot rely upon West Virginia or Iceland. You can't just say, oh, well, if I don't like what's going on, I'll just go to West Virginia. Because the moment you leave the major metropolitan areas and you go hide out in West Virginia is the moment you've decided to not be part of the global discourse. You've decided you don't want your voice to be heard. You don't want to participate in the economy. If you don't participate, you don't get a voice. You don't get a say. You don't have power. You can go hide out in West Virginia, and there's some beautiful land. I'm not saying it's a bad state. I'm not, trashing on West Virginia, but I'm saying that if you go there, you're essentially hiding from the problem. You're not going out and confronting the problem. And confronting the problem really means coming up with a strategy to deal with multiculturalism. Monoculturalism is available for you in West Virginia. Go to West Virginia, it's a monoculture. Go to Iceland, it's a monoculture. There are monocultural, you can go to Belarus, you can go to Siberia. There are opportunities for monoculture, monoracial, monocultural, monoreligious even. There are options where you can go and everyone thinks the same thing. Everyone's very dogmatic. No one's thinking outside the box. It's all the same thing. You can go and seek that out and go live among those people. My problem with that is you're essentially saying you don't want to participate and therefore you don't want to have a voice in what the global culture is going towards. So my opinion is if we want to have a voice, if we want to shape the culture going forward, the global culture, because technology has created a global environment. We're not just limited to our own town or our own city or our own nation. Actually, the words that we say travel across the world, and I know this. I'm impacting people in Britain, in Australia, all over the world, and I'm being impacted by these people. So it's a global conversation, a global culture that's forming. And really, it's not that we're all just coming together, holding hands and singing Kumbaya, but it's that what unites us is not necessarily, oh, I come from Australian culture, or I come from British culture, I come from American culture. As long as we can speak the same language, and English is a pretty common second language for a lot of people in the world. I have, Dutch viewers, and I love people from the Netherlands. So you've got all sorts of different people, and really what unites them is their shared values. The thing is that not everyone has the same values. So when I hear someone saying, I want a monoculture in America, I'm like, whoa, that's not my values. I don't value a monoculture. Ever since I was a very young child, I've always valued different ideas and different concepts. I'm always the kind of guy who, when I see, the black kid in class who no one wants to be friend with, I want to go up and talk to that person. I want to go be friends with that person. Now, if that person happens to beat me up and steal my lunch money, I'm probably not going to want to be friends with them anymore. But, I would still nonetheless find the next weird kid, next weird person. I'd always want to talk to them. Even if I didn't have to, even if I personally wasn't forced into that social outcast role, I always wanted to seek out different people and different perspectives. That's just who I am. And when I look at the grand scheme of civilization, what's going on today, I see that as a successful thing. If you're able to go out and understand different people, empathize with different people, understand where people are coming from, then that gives you an edge over closed-minded people who just stick to their guns and stick to their dogma. That's a very fragile worldview where you don't allow any skepticism in. I think it's a much stronger worldview where you're able to kind of empathize with different people and look at different people and understand them and not be exclusionary and not be burning heretics or whatever. But you're saying, let's have a conversation, let's have a global conversation here. So that's what I try to engage with, and I see multiculturalism as the future, and the question is, how am I and my descendants going to survive and thrive within multiculturalism? Because that's the challenge. How are we going to do that? I don't think the solution is hiding in West Virginia. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe hiding in West Virginia is truly the best thing you could possibly do. I disagree. But if you want a multiculture or you want a monoculture, go to West Virginia. If you want to survive the future, which is what I'm planning for, you have to come up with a model where you can sustain your identity within a multicultural scenario. And that's what I'm working on. I think it has to be a globalist solution, an internationalist solution.
We got to make sure these new Americans are actually Americans, and they don't want to blow us all up. Because it's not clear why they're here, is it? It just isn't.
I think it's very clear why immigrants are here. Immigrants are here mostly for economic reasons. People don't realize this, but picking tomatoes in Mexico means you're living in a dirt hut. Picking tomatoes in America means you're living in a trailer, or you're living in a government housing or something like that. There is a huge, and I mean, go try living in a dirt hut and come back to me and tell me, would you be willing to move temporarily, spend a couple weeks or months of your life moving, transitioning, learning some basic English or whatever, doing the same exact thing you'd be doing back in Mexico, which is picking tomatoes, or doing construction work or wherever. You're going to move from living in a dirt house to living in a trailer where, by the way, your kids are going to get an American education that's extremely valuable. America spends tens of thousands of dollars on education per student. You're not going to get that in Mexico. In all likelihood, depending on the location, even if, inner city teachers, disproportionately white liberals go in the inner city and they try to teach them kids, well, if you're a Mexican, you're looking at that, you're like, wow, I'm going to get free education for my kids, top world-class education, which America does have, by the way. Oh, we're so bad. Look, Finland's at the top and we're at the bottom. Well, if you break it down by race, we are at the top. We are at the top. We're up there with Switzerland. We're up there with Finland. We do a great job of educating kids. Now, it's not our fault that we educate kids and there's disparate outcomes. If I try to teach a dog calculus, It's not my fault if the dog doesn't learn. Now, of course, with enough training, the dog can learn a lot of cool tricks. I'm not saying that people can't be improved, and I'm not saying that everyone in a group is exactly identical. Of course, bell curves exist, but we have to understand that still, no matter the fact that we do have mass immigration, we are quickly becoming a non-white country, still, Mexicans who come to America, they know their children will receive a world-class education, and because of the race-based affirmative action we have in America, they're going to have access to the top universities. If they are smart enough, if they so choose, they can go to top universities, get a world-class education. That's not something available in Mexico. They have access to world-class medical facilities here in America. They have access to, they're not the best roads in the world. Our infrastructure is pretty crappy, but it's a hell of a lot better than Mexico. Crime in America, much lower than Mexico. Drug cartels, drug gangs, we do have our share of gangs. Most of them, by the way, not composed of Chinese people, not composed of Japanese people. So we don't have a problem with minority gangs. That's not the problem per se. If the country was majority black, the problem would not be minority gangs. So we do have a problem with gangs in the country, not nearly as bad as Mexico. So to me, in the case of Mexico, in the case of Somalia, in the case of Guatemala, in the case of Nicaragua, in the case of Cuba, in the case of China, in the case of many, many different countries in the world, why would someone choose to go to the United States? It's very, very clear to me. There are a whole host of benefits, a whole host of economic reasons, institutional reasons, that your children are going to get a free education, your roads are going to be decent, the police force is going to be somewhat of a first world police force. Again, it's not perfect. We're not like Norway or something like that. There was a long way of improvement that we could get to that Scandinavian level, which currently the bar is being lowered in Scandinavia, so we might reach that faster than you can imagine. But, we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but we're so much better in a number of factors that many, many people are drawn to America because they're going to be paid more for their same labor. Their children are going to get a better education. They know the health care is better. They know the police services are better. They know the roads are better. They know everything's just better. They know there's more opportunity for education. So if they're looking for a future for their children, they know America is the place to be a lot of the time. And so, yeah, that's why a lot of people are coming to America. It's very transparent to me. I don't think many people at all are coming to America to blow anything up. And I actually I'm increasingly frustrated with this notion that anything even slightly approaching a majority of any group, including Muslims, it's a very small percentage, less than 1% of Muslims, who are ever going to go into a country with the intent of blowing something up. It's less than 1% of 1%. We're talking about, if we compare the jihadi population to the average population, we're talking about, 1 out of a million, 1 out of 100,000. Now, in terms of criminal activity, that's something different. People come in and they see a white woman who has a bikini on and she's walking around in the middle of Walmart, or she goes to a party, she gets drunk, and she's wearing a mini skirt and she's, wearing a bralette, or whatever you call those things. It's like half bra, half shirt. You don't know what's going on. And she passes out at a party, or she's extremely drunk, and someone who's an immigrant says, well, back in my country, she'd be fair game. It wouldn't be illegal to have sex with her because it's kind of her fault. That would be the attitude of a Mexican. That would be an attitude of someone from the Middle East. And so in their mind, they wouldn't necessarily be doing anything immoral. Of course, there are other factors to that as well. So when we talk about a lot of these crimes, certainly there's a criminal aspect here, but the stereotype of blowing up just seems to be so off the mark. The amount of Muslims, or the amount of immigrants total, again, the amount of immigrants total who are blowing themselves up, it's less than 1 out of every 100,000. Seriously. You're more likely to be shot by a police officer if you're white. By the way, if you are white, you're more likely to be shot by a police officer than if you're black. If you're black, the cops hesitate to shoot you. That is statistics. Now, the fact is blacks have more police encounters, and so they're more often shot. just for that reason. But in terms of, and we're talking proportionately here, not in absolute numbers, but you might have a limited number of encounters with the police, but proportionately, number of encounters with police versus number of police shootings, if you're white, that rate of police shooting goes up per encounter. Because the news media is not going to say, oh, look at this police brutality, a white man gunned down by a cop. No one cares. If it's a black guy, it's a huge media fiasco, and you're probably going to have you're going to be suspended without pay, and there's going to be a trial. So it's a reason for hesitation. And this is just the statistics. Another statistic they don't want you to hear is that female police officers use deadly force more often than male police officers. If a female police officer feels threatened, she's more likely to pull out her gun and start shooting than a male police officer. So if you want dead black men, hire more female police officers. So, that's the unfortunate facts of the situation. But, I don't like this stereotype of Muslims blowing up things because it's just not true. It just doesn't happen a lot. There are a lot of rapes that go on. Certainly there's low-level criminal activity, there's drug trade, there's gang activity, and certainly I don't like any of that, but to me I would classify that more as a cultural thing than an ideological jihadist thing. So I think we need to stop talking about the blowing up of people, because that's sort of a red herring, that's sort of a non sequitur. I've never been blown up, I don't know anyone who's been blown up. That's not the big problem. To me, the big problem is the low-level crime, the street-level antagonism. You walk down the street, and people look at each other, and there's an antagonism. There's a hatred there. It doesn't have to be any blowing-up activity for just to walk down the street. I feel like I'm hated in my own neighborhood. That's a pretty sick feeling, and it could drive someone to suicide, to get up at a morning every day. You go to work, and just everyone hates you because there's low-level ethnic hatred everywhere. That's terrible. So I think that the blowing up is sort of it weakens your argument, actually. I don't think we should even be talking about someone blowing themselves up. That it's much less physical than that. And to me, that's a boomer fear. Oh, the Muslims are going to blow us up. That's so boomer tier. I think we need to deal with this on a more fundamental level than things exploding. It sounds like that's like a Hollywood conditioning level type argument, to me at least.
When they start coming in and saying that Sharia law is going to run this place, the military's got to come in and do something. And if it's not going to be the military, if it's not going to be the police, if they've corrupted the government structure already, that's why we have guns, isn't it? So,
again, it's like saying that there's do-gooders and there's evildoers. And which side are you on? That's kind of... Sharia law is just a scare word. It's a scare tactic. People hear, oh, Sharia law means blowing people up. No, that's not what Sharia law means. Tell me the problem with Sharia law. I don't want anyone converting to Islam. That's not what I believe in. But tell me what is bad about Sharia law. Tell me. I think it's just a scary word that boomers and Zionists use to scare people. What's bad about Sharia law? Is it the fact that women are forced to dress modestly? Or is it the fact that it's alien to Western culture? Or is it the fact that it's, a Stone Age practice going back centuries? What is the problem here? What is the moral problem? Is it, the fact that people in the LGBT community are persecuted under Sharia law? Is that the problem? And why is that a problem? So, again, instead of focusing on a scare word like Sharia law, tell me what is the content. Again, if there's something valuable in Sharia law, if there's something good there, I'm not going to say, oh, let's just convert to Islam because there's this one good thing. But by the same token, let's not reject something good just blanketly. Oh, you drank water? Well, it says in Sharia law you have to drink water before you pray 3 times a day or something. Therefore, you shouldn't drink water. No, we can't just be reactionary in this way. When the media tells us, when Pamela Geller tells us that Sharia law is scary, Sharia law is taking over America, I have to be really skeptical of that. And I have to say, isn't this a distraction from what's going on? Sharia law is a very, very, very small part of the cultural landscape of America. Now, Europe is a different place, but if we're talking about America, then we're talking about a Muslim population which is smaller than the Jewish population, to give you a relative number. And the Muslim population, of that population, how many are strict adherents to Sharia law? How many, for instance, don't drink alcohol? How many, for instance, dress their women head to toe? How many, for instance, are against gay marriage? Well, a majority of American Muslims are in favor of gay marriage. So if we're talking about the threat of Sharia law, we're talking about, 10% of 50% of 2%. It's a very small proportion. When we actually look at the main powers in America, it's not Sharia law. I think that's a distraction. If we look at the main ideological powers in America, it's coming from, what is the ideology of Mark Zuckerberg? What is the ideology of Bill Gates? What is the ideology of Sheldon Adelson? What is the ideology of Carl Icahn? What is their ideology? Now, they might have differences between them. Maybe there is no overarching ideology. What's the commonality between them? What are their shared values? I would say that is the power structure, the billionaire power structure that we should be looking at, seeing what's worthwhile here, what's true here, what is good here. Do they have any good ideas? Do they have any legitimate ideas? And then what ideas here are hedonistic? What ideas are benefiting them as a billionaire class but hurting everybody else? So that's what I would be criticizing. That's what I would be putting under the microscope, not Sharia law. I think that's ridiculous. And to an extent that even does apply to the European context, because this whole migrant crisis was not created by Muslims. Muammar Gaddafi was trying to prevent a migrant crisis in Europe. He said, if you take me out, there's going to be a migrant crisis in Europe. And he tried to stop it. He tried to warn us. But unfortunately, people like Hillary Clinton was out for blood. She wanted to kill Muammar Gaddafi, who was maintaining stability in the region, maintaining the basically security in the region, and preventing this flow of migration over the Mediterranean into Italy, into Spain, up through Turkey, into Greece. So this flow of migration is a direct, logical, and predicted consequence of destabilizing the Middle East, which they called the Arab Spring. So take out Muammar Gaddafi, and of course this was foreshadowed by how we took out Saddam Hussein. That was a little test run over there. And then we attacked Bashar al-Assad. Now Assad is still in power, but he hasn't taken back his country. Part of the country is under the control of Turkey. Part of it is under the control of the United Nations in the Idlib province, where they still have Syrian rebels who are basically just Al-Qaeda agents, and then which was founded by America. And then you have the Kurdistan region, which the Kurds are also basically founded by America, supported by America. So he still hasn't taken back the entire country. It's still a divided country. And the Idlib province is a very significant province. It's not just some random province out there. So Bashar al-Assad has been hurt, and Russia has not won a clear victory there. If their goal was to secure the country for Assad, they haven't achieved that goal. America effectively has achieved the goal of dividing the country, and I don't see a future to reunite the country. I don't think it can be reunited at this point. I think Assad has prevented himself from being assassinated, essentially, but he hasn't taken back the country. So ultimately, it's a loss. If you look at it, he's lost territory. I don't think he's going to be able to gain it back. So yeah, these are the big questions that I have to ask myself. Is the problem the Muslim who's moving in looking for economic opportunity, who legitimately has different cultural views, who legitimately might be antagonistic against me because diversity plus proximity equals conflict? But is that the problem? Is the problem that there are different people out there who think differently from me? Or is the problem that there's a hostile elite that is trying to malevolently bring two cultural groups to fight one another? And is there a different way of having multiculturalism? I mean, is there a different way of going about things where you have freedom of association, where you have we can have an international conversation, we can have international forms of law and order, but we don't need to be at war with one another all the time. Are there models in the past? The Mongol Empire, the Roman Empire, the Greco-Roman colonies, or the colonies of ancient Greece before Rome was even around. The Carthaginians, who came from the Phoenicians, the inventors of the alphabet. We look at empires, we see peoples ruling vast territories, disparate cultures. We don't necessarily have to have this low-level ethnic warfare going on all the time at the level that it is today. I think we could allow for a more freedom of association. What that would mean is there wouldn't be so much antagonism between Muslims and non-Muslims, and that would free people up to look upwards and say, okay, well, now that we can stop fighting about silly things like Sharia law and suicide bombing, maybe we can actually ask who is actually running the show, who is pitting Muslims against non-Muslims, who's creating this antagonism in the first place, who's forcing us to live together instead of allowing for freedom of association. Who is doing all this? Why is Europe experiencing this inward colonization where we're bringing in people from the third world? Why did our birth rates collapse? Why do we have this disjointed age pyramid where we have an aging population? What resulted, or where did this come from? What caused this? And why is the solution mass immigration? Why couldn't we be sending Europeans out into Syria to improve Syria? See, that would be my idea. If you have a first world country and a third world country, instead of bringing the third world to the first world, why don't you bring the first world to the third world? That seems to be the logical thing. Mexicans and Muslims and Chinese people, they all want technology. They all want a high standard of living. They want good roads. They want good education. They want good hospitals. I say give it to them. I say let's expand outward. Let's bring the first world to the third world, not the third world to the first world. So I think we can all enjoy the fruits of science, invention, and learning and wisdom and truth, and we can share that with one another. And it doesn't need to be this constant low-level warfare and antagonism and hatred. We can do that in a way that benefits everyone and is voluntary. And, Japan has done this to a great extent where they've said, look, we want to adopt Western ideals, so we're going to hire Western experts to come into our country and teach us how to be Western. They've been doing that for about 200 years now. And they've been very successful with it. And they bring in Western white scientists to work on the robotics programs, and they've had a lot of success with that. So that, to me, it's not something where Westerners are going in necessarily forcing themselves on the Japanese, although unfortunately we do have a military base over there where there are rapes of Japanese women that go on. So it's not, white people can rape too. It's not just a one-sided equation. This is something that happens, when a conquering army goes in. Rape is a weapon of war, unfortunately. That's one of the tragedies of war. So, for the most part, though, looking over, Okinawa and military bases like that, a lot of the Japanese interaction with the West has been voluntary. They say, okay, we like your technology. We're going to invite you in to teach us about how to build certain things, or we can work together on certain things. And I think there can be that kind of cooperation, but can we do it in a way that's more voluntary than this thing where Hillary Clinton and Angela Merkel sort of unilaterally invite in millions of refugees into Europe? These third worlders, they want the first world, so let's give it to them. Let's go into their countries and help them build roads. Let's stop the civil wars. Let's stop killing secular dictators. Let's start helping them improve the standard of living for people in their own country instead of destabilizing their countries in the name of Israel. Why don't we start building them up and helping them and exporting our first world success to the third world? Why are we bringing the third world into the first world? Seems like the exact opposite of what you would want to do. So from my perspective, the first step isn't criticizing Sharia law. I don't have a problem if people want to practice Sharia law as long as they don't force it on me. The problem is you have leaders who are importing people in an effort to destabilize the country, to create problems, to create chaos, so that we're never questioning their actions. We're always looking down at our feet, or we're looking out on the horizon saying, oh, my neighbor is a Muslim, or my neighbor is black, or my neighbor is a Mexican, and we're always distracted with our neighbors. We're never asking who made these decisions, who wrote the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, who led us down this path. And if we never ask those questions, and we always focus on suicide bombings and Sharia law, then we are really we're really trying to put out a fire in our house without ever addressing the arsonist who keeps lighting our house on fire.
We're near the end, so don't be a neo-Nazi. Don't be a coward either. Do something, even if it's just talking on the internet to your computer. That's the point. That's the end. Take care. Peace.
So I engage with this video not because I hate the video, but it did inspire. I mean, if the idea was to provoke, it succeeded. It provoked me into a response. So, you know, what little audience I have is now going to be attracted to the video. It's an experimental thing. I'm not taking on Joel Davis here. I'm not taking a Joel Davis video and cutting up Joel Davis and dissecting the performative from the declarative, the linear to the sublinear. I'm not doing that. That's a little bit too high level. So we're just taking some plain talking, vulgar, understandable concepts, dissecting those, taking them apart. That's the level at which I'm capable of at this point. Maybe sometime in the future I will be taking on Joel Davis, not antagonistically, but productively in terms of taking that apart. But this is really an experiment. I don't even know. What I've done is I've taken a video, I've cut it up into like 20 different pieces, and now I've recorded almost an hour 45 minutes here of me talking. So I've got to save this video, split this video up, incorporate it into that, splice it together, mix it all together. So I don't even know if it's going to work. We're going to find out. It's all an experiment here on the Jockle Podcast. Hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.